Hello, welcome all to the next Twilight Tuesday session. It almost didn't happen. The museum had been keen to start them up again, but COVID-19 has been getting in the way. I was scheduled to do one about a month ago, but it got cancelled. When I got asked to do it by recording, I initially said no, because my talk depended on walking around the collections as part of it. And the poor organizer was tearing her hair out trying to find people to present, but most people were in the same situation. But then I thought, why don't I just do a different kind of talk and make COVID-19 the star attraction of the show, rather than an impediment to carrying on. I could talk about it without depending on having collections in front of me to talk about. So I thought I'd talk today on how COVID-19 has impacted the museum and the museum collections. So, this is the mummy in the Ancient Worlds Gallery. Her name is Ta Sejmet. She is over 3,000 years old. She's already dead. So how is COVID-19 going to threaten her? Well, when lockdown was first announced, there was much rushing around. We had to gather up our work so that we could work on stuff from home. Not so easy when your job involves actually looking at museum objects and repairing them, preparing them for display, that kind of thing. It's not like you can just take things home to work on. So we all needed to find other things to work on for a while. More importantly, we needed to ensure that the collections stayed safe while we were away and not looking after them, or not looking at them. We have many systems in place for keeping the collection safe, minimizing aging and wear, minimizing accidental damage, and we didn't want things to fall apart while we were away. So, one of the systems we have continually running in the background is our integrated pest management system. We're constantly monitoring all the galleries and stores for insect and rodent activity in case an unwanted visitor makes its way in. We have lots of wanted visitors, but we have to keep the unwanted ones away. You may have noticed that the museum is in a large park with trees and grass and forest around, so ideal habitat for a wide range of insects and a healthy population of rodents, despite Auckland Council having a trapping program in place. Human activity normally scares rats away, so we were expecting a surge in rodent activity during lockdown when there was no humans about. It wouldn't do if the rats overwhelmed our defenses while we were away, got in and ate their way through half the collection before we were allowed back into the building. We were locked down for weeks and not able to come in, and the rats could have chewed their way through a large percentage of the collection in that time if we weren't checking. Because of this, our rat man was on all through level 4, checking our outer defenses, our perimeter of traps that encircle the building, making sure that the traps were active and maintained. Our security guards are inside the building 24/7, monitoring the building all through lockdown, but they don't have expertise in collection care. Not only do we have pest traps throughout every storeroom, gallery in the building, but the building is climate controlled to maintain the right temperature and humidity for the collections, and monitoring equipment to check that the conditions are stable. During lockdown, we needed to keep up these checks. The museum has never been closed except for Christmas Day in the past, so COVID made us have to come up with some other plans quickly. The rules only allowed for one person from our department to come in during this lockdown. So this picture is a picture of Craig. He was our man on the ground, the designated person to come into the museum once every couple of days and check that there were no leaks, no outbreaks of silverfish or rats, that the environmental controls were all working and stable as they needed to, and no other unexpected forms of mayhem had broken out. So I'll go through a few pictures of Craig in action while talking about museum environment and how that affects collections. So temperature. Temperature is controlled in museums to stay within a certain range. You can imagine things like your old-fashioned wax seals would soften and melt if it got too hot, and things like paper, They yellow and brittle and age when it's too hot. Animal skins and taxidermy can shrivel up, dry out, and crack. But also on a more general level, all chemical reactions speed up with higher temperatures, well, almost all, which means that all the natural aging and degradation changes that happen in materials over time would speed up if it got too warm. So by keeping the temperatures lower, the whole collection will last longer. We have to keep this within the range of human comfort, though. You know, not many people would come to visit the museum if it was constantly an icebox. On the other end of the scale, cold also makes things brittle and they shrink. And if something's made of many different types of material that shrink at different rates, then you can end up with things breaking. Worst case scenario is things that swing from high to low in extremes, and freeze-thaw cycles aren't that great either. Fortunately, heat enough to melt wax is rarely encountered in New Zealand, and it almost never gets below zero. So the temperature ranges, the natural temperature ranges in New Zealand are actually pretty good. Humidity control is a bigger deal. It's even more important because it's tied to pest activity. All insect pests require a humidity above 65% to thrive, and if it gets above 70% humidity, things can get moldy. And the natural Auckland climate averages above 70% humidity year round. So if the HVAC system went nuts or conked out, you know, if it conked out, the humidity would go too high. If it went nuts while the building was empty and the humidity got too low, it could do things like cause wooden furniture and drum skins to split. Leather goes brittle and leather goes hard and paper gets brittle. So again, the worst case scenario is when things swing from high to low. All right, so next slide we have, this is Craig taking a break here by the dying gall. Another picture of Craig expressing his frustration with the post-pandemic world. And then back onto topic now. We also have to be prepared for disaster with our collections. The biggest risk we have in the building is leaks. If a big storm blows in, a window could break and water get in, or if the roof drains, they could get overwhelmed by the deluge and water could get in. This scenario actually did happen back when I first joined the museum about 10 years ago. Some plastic bags blowing in the wind and leaves had blown up onto the roof and down into one of the light wells. And a big storm happened over the weekends, and the bags managed to block up the roof drains there, and so that roof section filled up with water like a swimming pool until it overtopped the flashings and leaked down into the building. The next day, I had to respond to a report of water in the floor channels around Hotanui, that's the Wharenui in the Maori court. In tracing back the source of the water, I went into the carving store, which it was near there at that time. As we walked into the carving store, it was like walking into a thunderstorm. The water was just pouring from the ceiling. Fortunately, it somehow managed to miss all the artifacts and was just pooling in front of the door. And this gave us the opportunity to spring into action with our disaster response plan. In the middle of this, our brand new director of collections and research, my big boss, was touring around the building to get familiar with his new place of work. So what a good way to impress the new boss, have him rained on in one of the storerooms. And we learned from this incident to check the drains and the roof regularly for blockages and other damage. So that normally gets done at least once a month. And so that's an example of one of the checks that has to be kept up. So that's it for the sorts of things we're checking on. This is Craig discovering a cockroach. The next challenge for us was what to do when the doors opened again. After the first lockdown last year, the museum opened before all the restrictions had lifted. And so we also had to be prepared if COVID surfaced again. The executive team had a COVID response team set up that was figuring out how the museum could open up safely. As you were aware, there was a lot of concern for how long COVID could last on surfaces and how did you protect people from picking it up from touching things. You'll remember the news images of armies of workers in protective Tyvek suits and gas masks going around, spraying everything down with some mystery disinfection spray. They were even spraying it around outdoors to make sure that everything was completely disinfected. I'm sure that even the streams and the rivers there have all been disinfected, completely cleaned of all life forms. The recommendations coming out of the hotel industry and other places where large numbers of people gather and pass through was to disinfect everything with a mist of quaternary ammonium compounds, or quacks. Fortunately, the response team passed it over to us conservators to check out that it was okay to use around artifacts before bringing the men in Tyvek suits to hose down everything. Us conservators busily went to researching what was the best approach for disinfecting museums and collection items. From our pest management experience, we were immediately skeptical of the idea of spraying everything down. We don't spray pesticides on museum collections anymore to keep pests away. These sprays are composed of a fine oily mist that settles out on all the surfaces and leaves a sticky residue that can be difficult to remove completely from the delicate museum objects. The thing to remember about museums is that we're not trying to keep things safe for a lifetime. We're trying to keep things safe forever, which is much longer than a lifetime. So you can't just chuck things in the washing machine when they get dirty. So these oils that are settling on things, they're attracting dirt over time. And over a museum time span, things can darken to the point that they turn black. Also, the residues are chemically reactive, and the dust sticking to the surface may cause other chemical reactions. They can have pH that's acidic and cause things to discolor and crumble, or metals to corrode. We suspected the same risks from the quacks as well, the quaternary ammonium compounds, so we absolutely forbade the use of such treatments anywhere where they would come in contact with collections objects. Meanwhile, the industry people advising our COVID response team were recommending using the most pervasive, finest mist so that it would get everywhere. To stand strong on this point, we had to recommend something else instead. We had pointed out that museum collections are not supposed to be touched except by conservators and collection managers, and even then, we're supposed to be wearing protective gloves. The gloves are supposed to protect the museum objects from the people, but they also have the effect of protecting the people from anything on the museum object. We also pointed out that the virus dies out naturally in anywhere from minutes to about a week, depending on the nature of the surface it's settling on and how virus-friendly that surface is. If necessary, we could put the collection items into quarantine if we thought they were infected and that they might be touched by people. So thinking back to Tasejmet, even though she's been dead for 3,000 years, she might still have to go into quarantine just like you have been for the last few months. However, the response team wanted something more active as a response, so they felt they were actually doing something. So we recommended wiping down all touch surfaces, not the artifacts themselves, but anything that might get touched, with an ethanol solution, and wipe things down every 15 minutes or so, or between when they get handled. Ethanol is the alcohol that you have in your beer when you go down to the pub for a drink. However, the cleaning solution is a much stronger concentration than you have in your beer. It's stronger than even the strongest vodka on the market. It's about a 70% solution or more, so you couldn't drink it without sterilizing the cells of your entire esophagus. We already use this solution for regular cleaning of display cases in the galleries because it's a very effective degreaser and cleaner, as well as being a sterilizing agent, and it evaporates completely without leaving any residues that might affect the collection material. It just so happens to also be very useful for killing COVID as well. So the museum COVID response team has all sorts of other processes in place for ensuring people's safety, limiting numbers of people in any one space at a time, contactless entry procedures, but these procedures don't impact collections. So that's it for my talk.